We didn't know what that trucker convoy could be.
Right.
Ottawa being a capital city, we're at the ups and downs of different movements over time and protests. And, at times some of those movements have sort of died off. But in this context, for all the reasons we know, it kind of exploded and more people were getting onto this convoy piece. So, yeah, that's kind of how it arrived. Then, the first day was like, okay, well, they made a lot of noise. They're here. And then in the evening, the next morning, they weren't leaving. And then the behavior is starting to really enact. Mm-hmm. And if you recall, I believe they arrived on a Friday night or Friday afternoon. And then the Saturday morning, I know it sounds weird, but at that time, it was when businesses started to reopen, right? There was different levels of businesses that were reopening. So I believe it was the first weekend when the Rideau Center had no capacity limits in the mall. Obviously, there were still store-by-store limits, but there were still requirements to wear masks in the mall and in the stores. And the movement, or those who supported it, kind of flocked into the Rideau Center and created havoc. They didn't wear masks. They threatened people who were wearing masks. They were quite loud, quite obnoxious. It took the Ottawa police and the shopping mall operators 6 hours to empty the mall in the afternoon because CF Rideau wanted to remain compliant with the legal obligations of the time relating to the pandemic measures. So, I mean, that's the first that I could go on and on. Like, you just sort of see the behavior build up.
When asked about what the experience was like and how they experienced it, the resident was quoted as saying, "We had our hood fan on all the time to try and, keep some of the fumes out of our place. We also had fireworks going off too. A bunch of them, like in the middle of the night sometimes, in between two high-rise buildings. So we had a conversation about, what happens if one of these hit our window. Like, do we sleep on our left side just to make sure that we don't, if our windows explode, we don't get hit in the face? And then we also just had go bags packed in case there was anything, because there were all these stories on the news and stuff about, the building that had been set on fire in the lobby and stuff like that. And we don't know if it's, obviously directly connected to the convoy, but there was so much going on that it wasn't being policed."
What went into your decision to taking this case?
Well, it seemed like there was a real breakdown in order in Ottawa at the time, and our authorities, municipal, provincial, federal, all seemed to be not taking any kind of action. We weren't hearing any reassuring messages from the city or the police about what their plan was, and the situation just seemed to be getting worse and worse by the day, and we were kind of descending into a bit of mayhem in downtown Ottawa. As we let in work in downtown, we were hearing from all kinds of different people, different impacts that were being experienced by people in Ottawa. More and more stories were coming out about how people were being affected, and it just seemed like that nothing was going to change. So we were approached by someone, and I'd already been thinking about maybe something should be done, and that's where it went.
From your perspective, what were the residents experiencing that made them take legal action? If we could go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, the honking horns were, I think, the most extreme tactic that the Freedom Convoy protesters were using that were really inflicting a lot of harm on the people of downtown Ottawa. This wasn't regular car horns that we're talking about. This was very high decibel train horns and air horns that we see on semi-trucks. They're meant to only be used for very, very short blasts, a couple seconds at a time. But what these guys were doing is, it was clear they were organized and coordinated the way they were honking them. They were honking them, as we later found out in the litigation, like we suspected just from hearing it. But They were organized and they were all honking their horns for 10 minutes at a time, every half hour, from very early in the morning until late in the evening. And that sound, it's really hard to describe or explain. It was driving people crazy. You know, it was that tactic that really kind of changed my mind. I'm very supportive of the right to protest and freedom of protest, and I've worked on those types of issues for protesters for years. And, you know, the right to protest is always, you know, in my view, a great thing. You know, when people are organizing together and come together to associate, to advocate for a position, like that's democracy in action, right? And regardless of what the message is, when you see people organizing, that's typically a good thing. It shows that your democracy is healthy. And so even though I didn't agree with the message of these protesters, you know, initially I was thinking, well, okay, this is, you know, it's a big moment in Canada right now, and there's a lot of people who are hurting and disagree with the mandates, and so it's understandable and reasonable that they want to protest. But it was that horn honking that it had like a really sort of malevolent kind of dimension to it, that it was designed to hurt the people of Ottawa. That really changed my mind that something needed to be done, and that was that's why I got involved.
If you can say anything, what are some of the legal strategies that you employed in this lawsuit?
Well, the number one strategy that we deployed at the beginning was seeking an injunction to the horns. We brought that injunction, we filed those court papers. It was, I'm just trying to think now, it was about a week in to the protest. Yeah, it was about like 1 week in. And our main objective was to try to get a court order that prohibited the honking across downtown. And that was one of the reasons why we did a class action. The class action wasn't, like, to be honest, when we launched the case, we had no intention that this was something we were going to follow through on to try to get damages from the Freedom Convoy leaders and so forth. We did a class action because we had to try to come up with a legal strategy where a court order would cover all of downtown. So our initial client, Zexi Lee, we could have obtained a court order with an injunction prohibiting honking on her street and maybe 1 or 2 streets around her home. But to try to get the court to say, oh, well, there should be a court order that covers all of downtown, we had to show that we were in some way representing all the people of downtown. And the class action is a legal vehicle or a strategy to do that. So that's why we used the class action and the class action legal tool. And we were successful. We were able to get a court order that was, you know, supposed to prohibit honking all across downtown. We also were actually very hopeful that once we got that court order and once there was a lawsuit launched, that it would somehow get through to the Freedom Convoy protesters that they really were harming people in downtown Ottawa.
If you can say anything, what are some of the legal strategies that you employed in this lawsuit?